David Shearer.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Labor Party will support this bill at the first reading, and we look forward to receiving now the comments and submissions when we go into select committee. Sir, it's worth remembering that this bill was first put on the order paper. It was first signed, I think, in 2007 by the Right Honourable Winston Peters. It was put before the Select Committee as a treaty in 2009, and it's now, 7 years later that it finds its way into the Parliament. I don't know what's happened in the meantime, but it's welcome, and we will certainly be supportive of it. Sir, as the Minister says, the aim of the bill is to amend the Maritime Crimes Act of 1999 to implement the obligations under the protocol of the 2005 Rome Convention for the suppression of unlawful acts against the safety of marine navigation, and the protocol of 2005 again to the Rome Protocol for the suppression of unlawful acts against the safety of fixed platforms located on the continental shelf. It's worth remembering that the Rome Convention, the protocol, resulted from the Achille Lauro affair back in 1985, when members of the Palestinian Liberation Front hijacked the Achille Lauro, the passenger ship, shot a Jewish and American man at pretty much point-blank range who was in a wheelchair, and tipped him over the side into the Mediterranean. The ship then went on to Italy, where the Palestinian terrorists were imprisoned, went face trial and were imprisoned there. Since that time, there was a recognition that actually there was a bit of a gap in the law, and that most of the time the taking of a ship resulted or was reliant upon the laws of sea which related to piracy. This was an act of terror. It didn't have financial or private gain involved. It was actually a political statement, and so as a result of that, the first Rome Convention came into being. So this is a further manifestation on that bill or that convention that dated back into 1988, as I remember, if I recall, and this 2005 protocol amends that Rome Convention and the Rome Protocol to ensure that the maritime security framework established under those parent treaties can respond to contemporary transnational terrorist threats. It's worth thinking about that, sir. Back in those days, that was pre-Al-Qaeda, pre-9/11, pre-ISIS. A lot has gone on in the world of terrorism, unfortunately, since that time. So this bill enables New Zealand to ratify those 2005 protocols that amended the Rome Convention and relate to maritime terrorism, the illicit trafficking by ship of weapons of mass destruction or their delivery systems or any sort of related material around that, the transportation of fugitives by ship, the intentional causing of death or injury in connection with those offences, and maritime boarding. So effectively it broadens it in keeping with the changes that have happened in the world. So it's worth thinking about, sir, that largely the prevention of terrorism in New Zealand is very broadly bipartisan. I don't think there's a member in this House that would not support this bill. But it's also worth remembering that we rely heavily in preventing terrorism on a number of issues. First of which, of course, is the people themselves in New Zealand, and particularly I'm referring here to our Muslim community, which in many ways is our front line, our bulwark against terrorism taking root here, and ensuring that we have a good relationship with that community, and that community is well integrated into New Zealand, is probably the best defence that we have against the sort of events that we've seen in Paris and Belgium and so on. But so too, sir, do we rely on the professionalism of our diplomats. and ensuring that the diplomats that we have are of the highest quality and can put together the type of legislation that we have in front of us here and make sure that we are in fulfilling our obligations under the various treaties. And I want to mention two of those diplomats, the former diplomats now, Derek Leask and Nigel Fife, the two of our more distinguished diplomats, but unfortunately were targeted in what I can only really be called a witch hunt by in an inquiry which unfairly accused them of leaking documents, which they did not do. And the Ombudsman report that came out very recently exonerated those two diplomats, and it is now, sir, as the Ombudsman recommended, that they are owed an apology and compensation. I know that, for example, Derek Leask, it cost him tens of thousands of dollars to take his grievance into court and get his name cleared. He needs to have recompense for that and an apology. And I think it's behoving on the Minister of Foreign Affairs that he too offers those two very distinguished diplomats, Derek Leask, who served for 5 years as our ambassador or our High Commissioner in London, and he too offers those two men an apology. So I want to mention something else which I think is very, very important when it comes to combating terrorism. It is, of course, what is laid out in this bill in terms of ensuring that New Zealand fulfills its requirements under international law. We also have stepped up when it comes to sending our armed forces overseas to combat terrorism in various parts of the world. We did it in Afghanistan. We currently have troops in Iraq at the moment training the Iraqi military forces. So I'm not going to go through the issue of whether they should be there or they shouldn't be there. That has divided the country in terms of who supports it and who is against it. But I want to speak on one thing, and that is the way that we send our troops overseas. When I look at countries like Australia, the United Kingdom, the United States, the sending of troops overseas into potentially harm's way is recognised as being one of the most important decisions that a government and ultimately a Prime Minister can make. And for that reason, they adopt a far more bipartisan approach to the way they do that than we do here. Think back to when we sent our troops overseas, decided to make that decision in the end of 2014 to send our troops into Iraq. They were, as the government said, sent to fight terrorism in the form of ISIS. For many weeks or months, the government denied that we were going to send forces overseas, although everybody knew that there was training and planning going on for months amongst our armed forces. Finally, the government made the decision, and an unholy debate erupted in Parliament, where the Prime Minister accused Andrew Little and the Labor Party of not standing up for human rights and being gutless. I want to point out, I went back and actually asked the library, our parliamentary library, when was the last time the Prime Minister, unsolicited, mentioned the word human rights, and that was back in 2007 with regard to Zimbabwe when he was leader of the opposition. So it's a bit rich for him to stand up and talk about human rights when it suits him. But more importantly, sir, the point is that it actually would have been much better to engage across the House in an important decision like sending our troops overseas, share the information, be able to ensure that whatever happened and whatever decision was made, and it may have been that the government was not able to convince the opposition that it was a good decision to send these troops overseas. But nevertheless, we would have been able to engage in that process, and whatever happened, as we did anyway, they went with our goodwill and our best wishes. Sir, We do this in terms of the intelligence review that is ongoing now, and I'm a member of the committee which is looking at that, and it is done on a bipartisan approach. So what I would like to see is that we do exactly the same and take a much more bipartisan, a much more considered, a much more open view to when we send our forces overseas, because right now I believe it's unedifying the way that we could carry that out. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Call Mark Mitchell.